I would say the most powerful psychological stressor, in addition to to meditation and single pointedness of mind, was engaging in these stressful conversations. And in 2020, as we kind of anchored into lockdown, I started to write a column, a newsletter, every Sunday. It's called Commusings, sort of dubiously named. And and I was right. I mean, 2020 gave me a lot of fodder in terms of subject matter, given the pandemic and obviously the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing national inventory and social reckoning around racial justice, and then the election and every other possible emanation from Trumpistan. So I had a lot to write about, and of course it was a very kind of triggered time, but the idea was like, okay, I'm gonna send out these little buoys of hope every Sunday, such that people might feel less alone. And these were very sort of rigorously researched papers and thoughtful, I thought, anyways. And I included my personal email on them, and that database was like 1.2 million people. So on Monday morning, I would get 500 to 600 emails incoming, and yeah, it was like cresting my inbox like a tsunami, and many of them were sort of adulated the ego just enough. Oh, this was great and interesting. I enjoyed it, but I would get like 100 a week, filled with some sort of acute criticism, often like replete with many expletives, and people that were had found some issue with an idea or a turn of phrase or something. And some of these were just like, there was nothing I could do with them. Sometimes people would like copy and paste like Trump 2020 5,000 times and just send me, I don't know what to do with this. But it was, but then some people were thoughtful in their takedown. And I basically vowed to have an exchange. I would respond to every single email. And then, after the exchange, there was sort of a repartee that was developed. I would say, hey, do you want to join me on a Zoom call? And this was my great David Copperfield act, because generally people just disappeared in that juncture. Yeah, it's like, put me on a stage in Vegas and watch me get people to disappear. Anyone want to have a Zoom call? But I had about 26 hour-long Zoom calls in August, September of 2020 with people that vehemently disagreed with me. And, the result was like I built my psychological immune system, or that's what Schuyler calls it. My ability to kind of remain centered, not to take things kind of overly personally, to basically, disarm insults by not giving them any power. But I also kind of inadvertently learned a lot of skills around having empathetic and nonviolent kind of forms of communication. And, Emily, it was so interesting. Like, these conversations took on such a recognizable pattern. So they were with people on the farthest edges of like QAnon and Trumplandia and that world, but there were also a lot of people like on the far left, kind of the defund the police crowd, or people that just didn't feel that it was appropriate for a white man to be kind of centering himself in a conversation about race or whatever. There's just a lot of people from all sides of the equation. And I would get on these Zoom calls, and there would be kind of an exchange of pleasantries and sort of a hello, and then kind of unlike this conversation, I would say basically nothing. And for 45 minutes, these people would just kind of gish gallop their life over me.
They would share
And
personal stories, or they were going on about the topic.
no, they're personal stories. Yeah, I mean, you're right. The former. They basically just told me their life story.
Ah,
And I would say 5% of the time, we would get around to actually talking about the issue that originally had put us at loggerheads. But for 40 minutes, 45 minutes, they would essentially just tell me their entire life story. And it was just fascinating, especially like the third or fourth one. I'm like, whoa, this is just the same pattern every time. And so I just eventually, I didn't have any training at that juncture in like nonviolent communication. I mean, that's a real approach. This guy, Marshall Rosenberg, built this whole system around nonviolent communication. I eventually got into it because I was talking to my friends about it. They're like, you got to check out this whole system for
yeah.
this stuff. And I'm like, okay. But I was kind of instinctively doing some of it.
Mm-hmm.
So people would be talking about their life, and I would be like writing down of like, ooh, I have daughters too. Like, oh, I was born in Chicago. Like, ooh, yeah, I drove cross country and my car broke down. I would write down kind of places of life convergence between me and these people's stories. And then by the time they had exhausted themselves, I'd be like, oh, that's, I have 3 daughters too. We're in the 3 daughters club.
Uh-huh.
And they're like, oh my God, what's that like? And I'm like, well, mine are teens now and it's crazy. And they're like, oh, well, mine are already flown the coop. And, you've got, empty nesting is hard, but, you've got a whole life in front of, it basically like just changed the whole tenor of the conversation. And I started to develop all these skills around it where it's like you'd walk into these conversations and you would not be looking for agreement. Solution was not the goal. Connection was the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And from that place of commonality and shared experience, I like made 24 frenemies, who I still text with. And these people are like still trumping about or still, on the far left or whatever. But, we found a way to see humanity in each other.
Yeah.
And people, in the end, what I realized, Emily, really is that people just want to be seen and they want to be heard. And if you can create a safe and secure container for people to be seen and heard, there may be nothing better to spend your time on.